Hello again, Psych 370 students, and welcome to the fourth and final video lecture for this week. In this one, I just want to say a little bit about animal research. So I'll be talking about the purpose and the ethics of using non-human animals in research on learning. And so this is obviously an important topic, right? After all, in the weeks ahead, as we get deeper into the material for this course, we're going to come across many research studies that focus on the behavior of rats, dogs, chimps, and other animals in order to try to identify principles of learning that apply not only to those species, but to humans as well. And guys, the first thing that I'll say about this is that learning researchers do have good reasons for using animal subjects in their studies instead of humans. For example, one major reason is that the use of animals allows researchers to achieve a greater degree of control in their experiments. So, for example, it's typically the case that a given laboratory animal's lineage, its ancestry, is known. So, by using animals instead of humans, we can exert more control over the possible effects that different genetic histories might have on our results. A related point is that researchers can also control the previous experiences of animals to a greater extent than they can those of humans. So, for example, if I want to know how caffeine affects behavior, well, then if I use human research participants, it's probably going to be the case that some of them use caffeine often, some of them will probably be daily coffee drinkers, and others might never have more than the occasional Coke. Now, of course, I can balance out differences like those by using random assignment, but I'd obviously have more direct control, more exact control over a variable like previous caffeine intake if I used laboratory animals, because then I could ensure that prior to my experiment, all of my subjects had no exposure or the same exposure to caffeine. So, greater control, that's a big advantage of the use of non human animals as subjects. And of course, another advantage of using animals in research is that they are simpler organisms than humans are, and that relative simplicity makes it easier for researchers to learn more about basic processes and basic phenomena. So think of it like this: if you want to know how engines work, then you'd probably be better off by studying a lawnmower engine at first than you would a jet engine, right? The simpler design and the smaller number of components in the lawnmower engine would just make it easier for you to identify the basic properties that make engines work. And you can apply the same kind of logic to the principles of learning. So, one of the reasons that psychologists use animal subjects in research is that we expect it to be easier to discover those general principles in simpler organisms where the behavior that we observe isn't complicated by as many variables, like, say, language or culture, as human behavior is. So, there are certainly some advantages to be had by conducting research with animal subjects. Still, many people do object to the practice of using non human animals in research, and they do so on various grounds. For example, some people would argue that animal behavior can't tell us about human behavior anyway, because what we observe in non human animals does not generalize to humans. That's one objection that some people raise to the use of animals in research. But as it turns out, there are many examples of discoveries that were first made in animal research, but that clearly apply to humans too. So, for example, Ivan Pavlov first discovered classical conditioning in dogs, but that's a phenomenon that human beings obviously exhibit too, right? In fact, as we'll see in a few weeks when we cover classical conditioning, we can apply the principles of it to very human domains like advertising and the treatment of mental illness. Another example, Edward Thorndike formulated his law of effect based on what he observed in cats, but human beings also learn to repeat actions that are followed by desirable consequences and not to repeat actions that aren't, which is the law of effect in a nutshell. And B.F. Skinner used pigeons originally to show that behaviors will persist for longer if they're only reinforced some of the time as opposed to all the time. But if you visit any casino, you'll see that same effect in humans where gambling behavior is very persistent because it gets reinforced on what we call a partial schedule of reinforcement. And of course, this is all specific to psychology, right? It's all specific to the study of learning. But if we took a broader view of animal research in science in general, then we'd come across examples like the polio vaccine and antibiotics and the development of surgical procedures to replace diseased heart valves or damaged corneas. So we're talking about huge advances here, right? Ones that have been extremely beneficial to humans, but ones that were first discovered in research that relied on non human animals as subjects. So it's hard to argue that animal research isn't valuable or that it isn't applicable to humans. Proponents of animal research can refute those claims. However, an objection to animal research that's more difficult to dismiss is that it isn't ethical. So, for example, some people would argue that to use non human animals in research is to violate or downright ignore the fundamental rights that those animals have as living creatures. After all, a rat obviously can't consent to participate in a research study the way a human can, right? And in many cases, the reason that animals are used as subjects in the first place instead of humans is that it would be considered unethical to do the same research with humans. So, for example, no researcher is ever going to lesion human brains in order to observe the effects that those lesions have on human behavior. But fewer ethical concerns do tend to arise when that same research is carried out on rats. And guys, I'm not here to say whether that's okay or not. All right. I'm just telling you that's the way things are. And I'm sure we have some differing opinions in the class about whether animal research like that is or isn't ethical, which is fine. So the point is, even though psychologists can refute the claim that animal research isn't valuable, they can't really refute the claim that it's unethical. People can and will disagree about that. However, since psychologists, for the most part, are of the opinion that animal research is necessary and irreplaceable, we do have certain guidelines in place for how to mitigate the ethical concerns that can arise from using animals in our research. And to help ensure that researchers follow those guidelines, institutions that use non human animals in research are required to have what's known as an Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, IACUC, which we often refer to as an IACUC. So, one of the things that the IACUC does is before a research study is actually conducted, the proposed procedure has to be presented to the IACUC, and then they can either approve the study, reject it, or require that certain revisions be made so that the study is done in accordance with our ethical principles. And I've got a few of those principles listed here on the slide. So, the necessity of the study is one thing that the IACUC will consider. If the research doesn't stand to tell us anything we didn't already know, or if it doesn't have clear educational value for the students who are going to be working with these animals, then it'll be deemed unethical and it'll be rejected. Similarly, if the proposed research calls for exposing animals to aversive stimuli, what we call aversive stimuli, like electrical shock, surgical procedures, anything painful. So anything that an animal would prefer to avoid would be what we'd call an aversive stimulus. And if the research is going to involve any aversive stimuli, then it has to be clear that those aspects of the study are necessary in order for it to answer the questions that it's asking. And the animals shouldn't be exposed to any aversive stimulation beyond what's absolutely necessary. So, for example, in the case of surgery, proper anesthesia should be used. And in the case of electric shock, the intensity and the duration of the shocks should be kept within reasonable and appropriate limits. So, the IACUC ensures that the proposed study has some clear scientific or educational value. It limits exposure to aversive stimuli so that it doesn't exceed what's absolutely necessary. And then finally, one last thing that the IACUC, the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, does is that they're also responsible for ensuring that the animal's living conditions are acceptable. So, for example, they should be housed in a clean and humane environment. They should have veterinary care available to them. They should have an adequate supply of food and water, unless deprivation of food or water is an essential part of the study, in which case, again, it shouldn't extend beyond what the research requires. So, the IACUC is an important safeguard against any ethical violations that could possibly occur when research with non human animals is conducted. Okay? So, guys, as a final word on animal research, I'll say, it is a thorny issue. It's probably always going to be at least somewhat controversial. But thanks to oversight from these care and use committees, and thanks to leadership from organizations like the APA, we can at least minimize the ethical concerns and the objections that people have to using animals in research. Okay, well, that's going to do it for the video lectures for week 3 of this course. And as always, if you have questions about any of this stuff, then please do let me know. Okay, take care, guys.